return of the Daleks in Day of the Daleks was on the whole a success for the show, despite whatever issues on the creative side that particular story had, and it's therefore not surprising they returned again so soon. However, it's important to understand the circumstances in which this return happened, as it took place in a fairly unique way, and one that would shape the two stories involved. See, there's two important things to remember about Frontier in Space and its immediate sequel, Planet of the Daleks. First, they're in Season 10, which was the season in which the history of the show and the milestone of 10 seasons was being celebrated. The season started with the already covered The Three Doctors. Producer Barry Letts' other big idea, apart from that though, was to do a 12-part Dalek story like the Daleks' Master Plan, because he hit his head or something, I don't know. Now, admittedly, the timeline of Master Plan's appointment with the standard issue BBC Flamethrower trademark is a bit unclear, so whether Letts would have been able to watch all or part of the story and able to test this idea is unknown. I'm going to guess probably not, because even if it existed, it should have been blatantly obvious that the story's biggest weaknesses was its length, which led to the story being drawn out, poorly paced, and having entire episodes just feeling totally irrelevant and waste of time. Whatever its strengths, is Letts wants to try and recapture them. This would have been perfectly achievable within the space of a 6-parter or probably even a 4. Now, someone clearly told Letts this was a bad idea, so it was modified, instead being two 6-parters that were linked but nevertheless separate. This had advantages and disadvantages over the 12-part solution, the advantage being that structurally there was no need to tell a story that needed to be stretchable to the 12-part length, as it did 6-parters all the time, so writing that length was nothing new. It also meant that there'd be a clear and distinct break between the storylines, in clear contrast to the Master Plan approach of rather haphazardly throwing its plots together. The disadvantage though was that they actually had to, be a link between the two of them, and this was a difficult thread to balance. Too much connection, it would just be a 12-parter and all but name with the trappings that would bring. Too little, and well, we get what we've actually got. Two stories of only the flimsiest of connections that end up feeling as if they're two stories with similar bases back to back. This is the reason this story is notorious for its fairly crap ending, because it all just wraps up so it can link into the next story, which then literally abandons every plot thread this story brought to do as completely its own thing. Now, admittedly, this is mostly the fault of Planet of the Daleks rather than this story, and we'll get to that in a few weeks' time. But ultimately, the linking hurt the story because its second biggest flaw is that, well, it's just very poorly structured and thought out, and you get the feeling that not being allowed to have a proper ending probably didn't help that. The biggest drawback of the story is the other disadvantage, that even with the actual story cut down to 6, frequently they had no fucking clue how to properly stretch their stories out to 6 parts, and the reputation of the 6-parters of the 70s ending up heavily padded is somewhat justified, and there's no better example of it than this. The main flaw of the story is that the plot simply does not fill out 6 episodes, no matter how hard writer Malcolm Hulke tries. So much of the story is just utter dead air, dull padding that goes absolutely nowhere, and that's because there's 47 or so extra minutes the story does not need and is worse off for having. Whether as a 4-parter it could have been tight enough to be as effective as it could have been, who knows, but it was certainly never going to be achieved as a 6. Before we go into all of that, the production is where we usually start and why I changed the habit of a lifetime. This story was directed by Paul Bernard, who had also done Day of the Daleks, a previous Dalek story. His work here is fine. It's fine. Doesn't stand out in either direction, it's competent without being noticeably good. He points the camera in the right way and the editing cuts at the right time. Sometimes directing isn't really that noteworthy in television, and this is an example of that. It's fine. To be honest, it's actually the least interesting part of production, as there are other parts I do actually want to comment quite a bit on. Firstly, the effects. Now, there are some duffs here. The Ogron Eater in episode 6 is pretty laughable, to the point where Barry Letts found it so embarrassing to get the episode rewritten to reduce its involvement, something which did not help an episode already as a disadvantage, as we'll explore in a little bit. But there are positives too. The space model work I think is pretty good for the time and budget. It's certainly more pleasing on the eye than some later attempts, and frankly most of early New Who's poorly aged CGI, but never mind. And given how much the story relies on sort of space battles and stuff, that's definitely an advantage. And the makeup for the Draconians is excellent. These guys are one of the true successes of classic Who alien design. But those aren't the main things I want to highlight. That's that this is honestly, in my view, a story with some of the best set design of the entire classic series. The designer, Cynthia here, only worked on this story, to which I ask, why? Her work here is excellent, all the sets look fantastic on their own, and it will have a unique identity that really adds character to the world of the story. I've included some examples on the screen to show you what I mean, but some of them give a vibe of a 60s Bond movie, which I think in a 1970s BBC science fiction programme is no small feat. If we're going to be bored to tears by spending an episode watching the Doctor very slowly try and escape the Master's spaceship, but it's good she went to the bother of making it as nice to look at as she did. And as for the rest of the production as a whole, well, it's a Pertwee story. You pretty much know where you're going to get there, don't you? Which then does bring us to the script. This story was written by Malcolm Hulke, a writer I've mentioned before, but I've not yet covered one of his stories. Hulke, I think, is one of the most interesting writers the classic series had. The most repeated factoid about him is that he was a fully fledged actual communist, not the wishy-washy student angry about having to do homework so they wear a Che Guevara t-shirt. I'm talking about a fully committed Marxist. He'd previously in fact been a card-carrying member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, but had left prior to writing for Who. I do remember reading somewhere that it was the Soviet invasion of Hungary in the 1950s and the CPGB's response to it that caused him to leave, but I've not really seen that backed up in general, so sort of take that with a large packet of salt. Anyway, Hulke's politics were always present in his work in one way or another, but why I find him so interesting as a writer was the way he included it. Unlike in later classic Who and New Who, where the political message was just sort of shouted by a writer deliberately looking to make a message, "You're going to have to pay for air!" Hulke let the politics be the basis of ideas, setups and backdrops. It became weaved into the tapestry of the overall story, and was never allowed to take over. The message was there, but it wasn't about the message. Hulke always focused on his stories and his characters, and allowed the politics to be effective in their own way. That's not to say he was anyway diluting or compromising his message, that's the last thing he ever would have done. But his stories are always stories first, and that makes them fascinating to engage with even if I don't always agree with his views. Even his weaker stories do this very well, and this story is no exception. It's definitely one of its strongest elements. Now, you don't need a history degree to work out this is a pretty transparent allegory for the Cold War. While it wasn't at its chilliest in the early 1970s, it was still a dominant feature of the political and social landscape at the time. The role of the humans as the West and the Draconians as the Soviets is pretty obvious, but Hulke avoids the obvious of making them into strawman caricatures of those sides. Making the Westerners all greedy and capitalistic and the Soviets all regimental and conformist. The easy wins. That's not his style at all, and a great strength of the piece is there are shades and depth to both that add so much, while also showing the clear mirror between the societies, and is also very telling about Hulke's view of the world at this stage. Take the humans, his representation of the West, which he portrays as an authoritarian and militaristic state, with political repression and torture, most likely as a way of showing the similarities between them and the Draconians, and therefore East and West. But the strength of this is in the nuance it's given. There are cooler heads and more aggressive types together. Hulke goes to pains to show the diversity of opinion. And he doesn't do this through straw men either. General Williams, for instance, could easily have been a generic shoot up the baddies type military man, and while he is certainly aggressive and war eager, you get a sense of why he feels that way. Bitter experience has taught him that he has to feel that way. You also get a sense he takes no pleasure from the coming of the war. He's not aching for a chance to fight or anything. He's not happy to go in just because for the shooting. He's no happier about it than anyone else is, but he's simply too used to feeling it's the only solution. Equally, the president could easily have been a generic give peace a chance type, but she's no less alarmed by the threat than the general. They're more similar than they realise, but she's a politician and she's informed by a desire for diplomacy and political solutions, and well, a desire not to be thrown into a situation where she'll become known as the president who took them to war. Amusing nowadays, given the politicians who have started wars for pretty much the same reason, but nevertheless it informs her. We don't get a sense she's sure in her conviction for peace. We instead get the sense she's being crushed under a situation with no easy options, as leaders sometimes can be. Hulke's Earth is, as I mentioned, authoritarian, to the point where political opponents are locked up for life, which is a very exaggerated view of the West, where this was not something that happened in democracies at least, but obviously speaks to Hulke's worldview as a communist, that the capitalist states are authoritarian by nature and so forth. Obviously all mileage may hugely vary on how accurate an assessment that is, but it nevertheless gives shade to the conflict being set up. Two very flawed societies against each other avoids us automatically taking the sides of the humans just because they aren't the monsters. It's also maybe me looking too deeply into it, but the Peace Party people the Doctor meets on the moon, I also possibly see Hulke commenting on much to the left, that they're basically a bunch of useless activists. So they comment on going to demonstrations and writing speeches and not actually achieving anything beyond getting themselves arrested and locked up. I don't know, maybe I'm seeing patterns that aren't there, but I think that would work well the overall analogy and certainly would speak to Hulke's place as an actual card-carrying communist. Draconia and Draconians are representation of the Soviets, of course, and I do applaud Hulke for approaching this, as economics was of course the major dividing line in the Cold War between capitalism and communism, but given that wouldn't work as a theme of a Doctor Who story, and given how it ended up being done in New Who, probably should have stayed that way, Hulke instead uses the Draconians to highlight the Soviets as authoritarian, conformist and aggressive, but ultimately not much different from us. The reactions of the Emperor or the Prince mirror those of the President and Williams, to show the same interpersonal conflicts and differences of opinion do happen, but the two sides are mirror of the same ideas and societies and people despite the differences. The Draconian sense of honour also shows there's a lot more to them. They're not just militaristic and warmongering, they really are a people just as noble as we might think the humans would be. And that certainly makes them more than just villains, which they're definitely not. They're just people in the same way the humans are. Ultimately, though, what makes this work for me is how the Hulk concentrates on the human aspects. What makes this scenario work and what makes it an effective analogy is that it isn't being shoved in our faces, it's a story being told with realistic characters with realistic conversations. The general who doesn't know anything other than anger and resentment and tries to amend for the guilt he's always secretly harboured when he realises it's all been a lie. The politician trying to avoid being written into the history books as the woman who took them to war. The hothead prince with only the pride of his people to fall back on, being reined in by his more experienced father. These are all entirely believable and well portrayed characters, and how to work into the tapestry of the idea being put forward is a major strength for the story. In a similar way, the main plot of the story, that Earth and Draconia are being forced into a war, is also very well done, I think. The setup is simple but effective, particularly as it's very much show not tell because of how we see it first before it's explained. By the time we get to the President and Williams grousing about it, we've already seen it firsthand and know the real explanation, but nevertheless it feels very believable where things go because frankly, and I really salute Hulk for setting it up like this, it's very hard to think of any other reasonable reaction either Earth or Draconia can take in the situation. Their ships are being attacked and their people killed, and as far as they are aware, it is the other side doing it. I mean, they deny it, of course, but why wouldn't they? It builds up a good kind of tension that we, the audience, know there's another explanation, but there's no other reasonable course for either side to take given what they know. It's either stand by and let it happen, which is unacceptable because their people are dying, and it's pretty much tantamount to surrender, or they have to fight back. It makes the situation feel all the more urgent and tense, and it adds credence to the effectiveness of the villain's overall plan because we see in action how well it's working in driving these two empires against each other. And again, they're two empires we see that have shades, that they're societies with people and stuff like that, and how similar they really are, which adds even more to it. Indeed, along with the political stuff, the story's strength comes in how interesting the ideas it puts forward are, and this is a prime example of that. Leaving all that behind, another strength of Hulk's was always character, and while the characters of the regulars, semi-regulars aren't really the focus here, they do get their due anyway. This is a fairly typical Third Doctor story, which doesn't say much new for him, it has to be said, but nevertheless gives us a good look into what made this Doctor who he is. Determined, proactive, moral, and uncompromising. At no point under everything that happens, and let's face it, this is basically 6 episodes of him going through crap, does he even flinch under it. He brushes off nearly being asphyxiated with his usual bravado and is never dissuaded from his goal. To prevent the war he knows will be destructive and pointless. At no point does he ever cower or retreat. He's either resisting his captors passively, such as ruining the human mind probe and his constant attempts to escape. While so many of these scenes are dull, pointless dead air, as I'll get to shortly, it nevertheless does add to that aspect of his character. And of course, no matter what, he will not compromise in that goal to stop the war. The Third Doctor will stand up before the leaders of both empires and talk himself to death before he ever considers giving up. Again, doesn't have much new, but it does work as part of the Third Doctor's overall character, and I do think you can tell Pertwee is enjoying this one, which does have a bit more complexity to its themes and his character than most, which leads to a great performance. There are far from any complaints there. This story for me is Exhibit A, and why I will defend to my dying breath Jo Grant as a companion, because it highlights just how effective a story arc she had. The ditz we got in Terror of the Autons was a step down from Liz, to be sure, but the point was surely always that she would grow from there exactly as she ended up doing. Here, well, she still has her softer side, but she's become confident, intelligent, able and fearless. Yet dedicated to the Doctor no less than she's ever been. Nearly blowing up Unit HQ because of the Master's hypnosis in her first story was frankly just a point to lead us here. Looking the Master in the eye and defeating his attempts at hypnosis here, showing how far she has come and how much she has learned. It's not just the Master though. A standout scene is when she has stood in front of the President and Williams, the latter especially no doubt expecting her to just crumble in front of them, but she stands her ground almost as well as the Doctor does. Combined with an excellent performance by the always wonderful Katy Manning, who did such a phenomenal work in breathing life into Jo, this is a standout story for her, even if, well, she doesn't get to actually do much apart from get captured, participate in escapes, then get captured again, but don't let that overlook what is essentially a cap in her character arc, showing how being with the Doctor saw her grow from incompetent to confident and able, and how it makes her departure in 2 stories' time feel all the more satisfying. She clearly is ready to move on to a life of her own. As for the Master, well, obviously we now know this was Roger Delgado's final performance in the role, and it's very obvious this was never intended to be the case, as this is in no way a capstone on the character's time in this part of the series. A few weeks ago we covered The Deadly Assassin, which was his next appearance, and that was pretty much entirely because of the lack of setup here. Most of that was down, of course, to Roger Delgado's tragic death a mere 3 months after the broadcast of the story, but frankly I get the feeling that a lot of it was down to the fact that I didn't really have any idea how to use the character at this stage. His massive overuse earlier in the Third Doctor's era had been scaled back to just the 1 appearance this season, and I do get the sense of it he's just sort of hit it because he needed to show up at some point, and this made the most sense to do so. I never really get a sense from the Master of why he's really here. It's an evil plan to take over the universe, of course, but why he'd work with the Daleks and why he'd do so to this end is never really conveyed properly. I get the distinct impression Hulke was just not very interested in exploring it. For instance, at the end, the Master appears to be plotting against the Daleks further, which would make sense, he'd hardly be one to cower in front of them, but this is not explored in any way, it's just sort of stated and that's that. And it's the same for his overall plan, really. His plan feels a little too elaborate and forced, and that he managed to pose as this planetary governor for the sole reason of getting the Doctor and Jo, when he had absolutely no way of even knowing they'd turn up in the situation at all, never mind get captured in exactly the way they would, feels a little silly. There are positives to it. Delgado is a delight as always, and he always has some great character interactions with the Doctor and Jo. His banter with the former is top notch as always, and part of what makes the Jo stuff work so well is the Master's reaction to it feels just as natural as hers does. But ultimately, I feel like he's honestly a bit superfluous here, and I think he could have been excised entirely in a condensed version of this story. I'm not sure he's really needed to in order to discover it was the Daleks behind the plot the whole time. It is a shame this ends up being Delgado's final story, as regardless of how effective you think it is, it's clearly not meant to be that. But unfortunately, the tragic death of Delgado meant there was nothing that could have really been done there. Anyway, I've clearly transitioned over to the weaker part of the story, so let's look at the main one. This should not have been a six-parter, and I think if he was alive, Malcolm Hulke would be the first person to agree with me on that. So much of the story just fucking drags. Just endless capture and escape situations that pad out the length, and it gets so fucking tedious so quickly. There is at absolute best about 4 episodes worth of story here, and frankly, were they commonplace in any era other than Seventh Doctors, I think this probably could have worked as a 3-parter. So much crap just wastes time. There's a few sequences that perfectly encapsulate this. Firstly, in the first half of the story, we get a lengthy sequence of the Doctor and Jo being marched as prisoners through what is so obviously the Royal Festival where this will take you out of it a bit, but never mind. Oh no, they get captured by Draconians. Oh, good, the Doctor escapes, but then get captured by humans again and we're back to square one. Oh, and then the Ogrons can capture him, but then he escapes again and we're back to square one, etc. and so forth. God, at least when he gets transferred to the moon, there's something new happening. But all it ends up being is another fucking escape sequence that goes nowhere, only for the Master to show up and end the moon story there and then by taking the Doctor away, making the whole thing feel utterly fucking pointless. It just ends up being so repetitive and uninteresting that we spend about 3 episodes worth watching people not believe the Doctor and Jo, but interrogate them, recapture them after an escape. This extends into the second half as well. Basically, a whole episode is given up to the Doctor's attempt to escape from the Master's ship. Sure, it gives a nice bit of character for Jo as she shows her growing strengths and deception as she talks to herself in order to cover for him, but it's not worth watching the Doctor essentially spacewalk for what feels like a fucking eternity, only for, you guessed it, the whole thing to be rendered completely pointless as the escape ends up failing and the entire story would have gone on completely the same. I mean, yeah, it means they all get captured by the Draconians, but the change to accommodate that would have been so tiny there's no excuse for the shameless padding. Even in the last episode, when things are supposed to be picking up towards the conclusion, we get a pointless space repair scene and hooray, they've escaped from the artificial threat, whoop-de-doo. All these scenes have the clear purpose of padding and padding and padding and nothing else. And you get the feeling Hulke probably should have worked out a story with more scope to it, as this decision does not fit as a 6-parter. This also contributes to what I think is the other main weakness of the story, which I think that it just doesn't work as it's structured and set out. The story just lacks drive and energy. It feels like a journey from one plot point to the next and not much else, which baffles me because of the fantastic political and thematic setup how Hulke had so effortlessly done. It should have been easy. The padding hurts this because it's difficult not to get the impression we're going through the motions through yet another capture and escape sequence. And yet, I think back to an earlier work of Hulke's, The War Games, which he co-wrote with Terrence Dicks, who you might recall was the script editor of this period of the show and therefore would have been working with him here as well. And that story is 4 episodes longer than this one and has its fair share of pointless capture and escape padding sequences, for which it has received criticism, some fair, some unfair. But one thing we must never say about that story is that it lacks drive and energy. We always feel like we're learning new things, uncovering new mysteries, etc. This story does not achieve that. The main thrust of the story, uncovering the plot to start this war and convincing the two sides of it, it just feels painfully slow and unexplored, to the point where I'm sitting through the sequence of the Doctor's escape from the Master's ship going, what does this have to do with anything? It feels just, well, a little haphazard, like Hulke had a fantastic idea for the politics and the characters and decided the rest of it would just sort of come together. And frankly, I think the best example of demonstrating this is that all 5 cliffhangers are utter and total shit, and that the tension and menace only slightly above that of the Death to the Daleks floor cliffhanger. In a properly structured classic Who story, the cliffhanger is a perfect moment to hit home with some of the plots and ideas you're using. Let's take the War Games again as an instance, showing this writer and this script editor know how to get it right. Every cliffhanger is a brilliant moment moving the story along. The Doctor gets shot by the firing squad. We see the attacking Romans in demonstrating that time is not as it should be. Jamie is separated from the Doctor and Zoe to advance a section of the plot in the time zones themselves while they explore the base. The brainwashed Carstairs is about to shoot Zoe to demonstrate the effectiveness of what the Warlords are doing to the humans, etc. and so forth. They're there to end the episode for sure, but each one's used perfectly with the plot as it's developing, to give a real moment of tension before the credits roll. In this story, we don't get that at all. Usually someone says something a bit menacing and suddenly we see John Pertwee's name come up in the credits. It's just a sign of a structure that hasn't been properly thought out or put together, and it really lets down the strengths of this story. I do realise I have barely talked about the whole reason I'm doing this story, and that's the Daleks, and that's frankly because they are an afterthought to this, there's no question there. They turn up at the end of episode 6, posture a bit, and then bugger off after about 5 minutes and don't show up again. Now, I get why this is, they're here to set up the next story and to provide the link Let's wanted, but it doesn't work for two reasons. Firstly, that Planet of the Daleks carries on precisely naught of the plot thread set up in the story, which makes the whole thing pretty fucking pointless. And secondly, and more importantly, I think, they feel shoehorned in. There's no thematic or plot or story reasons or character reasons or anything like that. It needs to be the Daleks. They don't fit into what has happened at all. They've just been stuck into the scene because they sort of had to make the link work, and that was that. They just feel utterly superfluous here, and say what you want about Day of the Daleks, where they were literally inserted into the series script where they were not originally meant to be. There was some effort there to make them work and feel like they fit, but they're just not here at all. They turn up, do their voices and say exterminate, and that's it. It's a lazy cameo and nothing else. This also brings me briefly onto the conclusion. The setup of it to carry on this ill-advised linking means that Frontier in Space does not have a proper conclusion. The humans and the Draconians are told to bugger off after, you guessed it, another escape sequence, and that they have to go and try and tell the authorities themselves and sort it out themselves. So we just sort of assume the whole war plot ended without it being actually wrapped up. And the Doctor and Joe escape, and that's that. This epic story of war and politics and how people react to it just sort of stops. The resolution is poor, and I in no way blame Hulke for that, because what the fuck was he supposed to do? These two stories were supposed to be linked, and they aren't really, which means one gets no real conclusion when the other just ignores it. These are ideas I'll get into more when I get to Planet of the Daleks, as there's much more of that story's fault than this. Sure, this story gets a bit of a crap conclusion, but with a proper following up in the next story, that blow could have been considerably softened. But it was not, and well, here we are. Frontier in Space is a story that gives me a lot to think about, and I mean from a critical sense rather than being thought-provoking or anything like that, even though in some parts it is a bit, all the politics and stuff. I really like the idea behind this story. The main plot is set up really well, and it's interesting to think about and see in action. The politics is really well done, the character work is great. Only in a Hulk work would a character like Williams be anything other than a caricature, but he's not. He is a fully fleshed out character and it works. But, as interesting as it is to think about, the main bother I have is that it's just nothing like as interesting to actually watch as it is to think about. My main thoughts when sitting down to watch this for the review were that the ideas and the sets are fascinating, but I'm just bored to fucking tears of this 15th escape and recapture sequence. There's a great deal to enjoy on the screen, of course. Pertwee, Manning and Delgado are all at their best. The secondary characters all have depthed. In fact, one thing I didn't mention was how well Hulke imbues even the least consequential characters with more depth than most writers will give to their main players. This is not bad, at worst it's just dull, but honestly I think this is just more interesting as a conception than what it ended up as on screen, and a lot of that is down to making this a six-parter when it did not need to be, and providing it with a link into the next story it did not need to have. I have agonised a bit about the final score, but ultimately I did have to ask myself a question. Do I think this is a better story than the last Pertwee Dalek story I did, Day of the Daleks? And I have to be honest with myself and say, no, I don't think it is, which is why I'm awarding this a final score of 5 out of 10, meaning it's a typical of the quality you'd expect from Classic Who. Now, that's always a good average to meet, and it does have some great ideas, fine characters. You're never going to watch it and think this is utter dreck. It's always at a decent level. But ultimately, the ideas explored just aren't well integrated into the structure, and it suffers from just being padded and dull as a result. I wish, given how much I praise the ideas behind it, I could say it was better than it is, but I'm not sure I can. And such is life, and well, such is Doctor Who, eh? Anyway, in the new year, we'll be looking at the story it leaked into, Planet of the Daleks, to show just how much worse it can get. But before then, well, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas, is it not? See you on Wednesday.